So thank you, Kat. My sincere thanks to each of you for joining us tonight for this special program. The exhibit next door, which we'll have a chance to walk into towards the end of our conversation here, features a selection of the New York State Museum's Contemporary Indigenous Art Collection, an effort that was initiated in 1996 and continues to grow each year with new acquisitions. The exhibit, as I intended it anyways, is an opportunity to learn about relationships that inspire Indigenous artists' creativity. And it's also an opportunity to reflect upon how all of us collectively relate to each other and to the world around us. When the exhibit opened here, I wanted to invite artists represented in the show to visit the museum and present about their experiences and creative processes. My colleagues and I in the anthropology department frequently host visits to collections from Indigenous artists, knowledge keepers, scholars, students, and I really wanted an opportunity for Indigenous artists to share about their work publicly and in their own words, not just to an audience of myself and my colleagues. So to date, we have hosted Margaret Jacobs, Grant Jonathan, Diane Shenandoah, Jeremy Dennis, and tonight, of course, Pete Jemison. For me, and for this institution, the Indigenous Artist Speaker Series is part of the ongoing work we do to cultivate connection between collections and communities and to strengthen our relationships with Indigenous artists, communities, and nations. That's important because in 1849, the New York State Museum acquired an ethnographic collection of Haudenosaunee material through the efforts of anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan and Tonawanda Seneca leader Ely Parker, as well as other members of Parker's family, notably Ely's sister Caroline Parker. The legacy of that collection is the relationship it established between the State Museum and Haudenosaunee nations. And in keeping with the commitment and the responsibility of strengthening relationships with artists and communities, I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the ancestral lands of Munsee Mohican and Ganondagan Haudenosaunee peoples. Peter and I are going to have a conversation about his art and his art career, along with a look at some PowerPoint slides of his art. And then we will go into the gallery and look at his piece 1687 War, which is part of the exhibition. And I'll share just a few introductory words about our guest tonight, which is nearly impossible to summarize adequately here, so forgive me. But Pete Jemison is a curator, an artist, a leader, and a visionary whose roots are planted in the Cattaraugus community of the Onondaga or Seneca Nation. In his many roles as a leader and an artist, he curated exhibits at the American Indian Community House in New York City, taught art to high school students, exhibited in art shows at the National Museum of the American Indian and the Brooklyn Museum as a young artist, formed the Seneca Nation Organization for the Visual Arts with fellow Seneca artist Carson Waterman, organized traveling exhibitions, and eventually led the way for the creation of the Seneca Art and Culture Center at Ganondagan State Historic Site, where he continued to curate exhibits and develop programming and many other projects. If you haven't been there, the Indigenous Music and Arts Festival is this July 27th and 28th. I highly recommend it. And they have amazing exhibits, including one right now featuring Haudenosaunee contemporary artists, some of whom are represented in this show as well. In 2022, Peter officially retired from his position as leader and site manager at Ganondagan, and fortunately for all of us, he continues to curate and make art. So later this summer, his exhibit Summer with Friends and Family opens at 47 Canal Gallery in New York City, so another opportunity to see his curatorial work here in New York. And we're going to have a conversation and look at some slides, and then we'll have some time for questions when we're in the gallery looking at his art. But please welcome Pete Jemison.
Thank you.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure.
I'm sure I left something out.
Yeah. Niawes Ganot Swagwego on Nandawat Ga Ni A Gan Nonza Death Down Ni Yaso Ganondagan Ni Kanange. I guess I could say Hodion Ganosaske Ganonda Se. So I give thanks that all of you are well, and we say Niawes Ganot Swagwego, including all of you. The clan I belong to is the Heron clan, and they've given me the name Gan Nonza Death Down. And it is sort of difficult to say what it means exactly. I always say it just refers to responsibilities I have within our ceremonial way of life. I'm a faith keeper. I mentioned that when I say Hodion. I'm one of several faith keepers at the Newtown Longhouse. And I consider myself to still live at Ganondagan, even though there's, 600 and some acres now that are Ganondagan. We still, we know that it only is a small portion of the total community that was occupied by our people from 1655 to 1687. And so when I say Ganondagan Ni Kanange, I live and I work there, and I have, and I think I still do. And I guess I would say that. So just to kind of piggyback a little on what Gwen said, I really, after completing the building in 2015, I wanted to be able to occupy and use the building and experience it. I had spent about 8 years raising the money to build it, and so I did that. And around 2020, I suppose, things started happening in my art career that hadn't previously been happening at the rate or the amount. And so as I was leaving, the art career was going like this, and so I kind of timed it well, and I'm glad I did. I've had very good fortune to have my work collected and exhibited and so forth. So, but it didn't happen overnight, that's for sure. There were times when I had drawers full of art and offers to show, and I never thought I was ready to take on a gallery and be represented by a gallery. And so I was reluctant at first, and then I got persuaded to do that. So maybe we'll just take a look at some of the art, and we can start from there.
That sounds.
So I put together kind of a chronology, and I know Gwen has questions too, and I think those are good to talk about. In about 2007, the Seneca Nation opened really the first casino we had in Niagara Falls. And in that casino, they had a Three Sisters Cafe. And so I was commissioned to produce, in the end, I produced 7 paintings for the cafe. And this sunflower is one of those paintings that I produced for the cafe. And recently they came back to me, and this one will be in the summer show in New York that Gwen mentioned. And they had to be restored, get the spaghetti and the coffee and the other things that were accumulated on the surface. And they really did have food on them. They had been there until last year, really, is when we finally took them out and replaced them with prints of the same exact size and very, very well printed images. This one was also in the Three Sisters Cafe, and again will also be in the summer show.
Are these acrylic and oil?
They're just acrylic.
Just acrylic.
Yeah, they're just acrylic. I have to thank my oldest son for doing the background, and I kind of focused on the foreground or on the corn, but he took care of the darker areas of it. My oldest son, Brendan, and thank my son Ansley for putting together this PowerPoint. My youngest son. Sometimes my work really is very, I guess I would say almost abstract, and I like to use a lot of different media. This one is using egg tempera, and that's a medium that I really like. I also like handmade papers because of the decal and the variety of textures and surfaces that you can get. And these are like blackberry vines, sort of entangled in separating out the forms that come as a result of the linear patterns of the blackberry bushes. And but again, working it kind of, I always think of it a little bit like beadwork patterns, like doing beading around images of flowers or other things. And so those linear patterns are kind of a reflection of the way in which our women do beadwork. Not just women too, but others.
Well, you experimented with abstraction early on, too, in your art career. So was that influenced by beadwork as well, or what were your thoughts at that time?
Yeah, some of it was. The most abstract work I did was when I first moved to New York City. Right directly out of college, I was 21. I moved to New York City, and I sold the only thing of value that I had, which was a car, and I moved to New York and wound up selling art supplies first. But I had taken what they called modern math in college, and I was terrible. I mean, I failed it once, dropped it once, and then finally had to pass it in order to graduate. So I had this knowledge now of set theory, random, I could go on and on about it anyway. And it came in handy in interpreting stoplights in Manhattan, the number of plates behind a restaurant counter. It was like everything was more. And I kind of broke things down to a binary system. And that was the basis of my art, was understanding a kind of the binary system, all right? And this predates computers. Like this is 1967. And so I was just kind of literally have a piece of paper on the floor, a very large piece of paper on the floor, have a can with two colors in it, two pieces of paper with color on it, and shake it up. And whatever color came out, that's the color I painted. So it was completely random, except I had laid out a grid on the surface. And on one of my drinking expeditions, I was coming down Madison Avenue, and there was an opening at the Whitney Museum. And so my friend, my neighbor, he had one ticket for the opening, and he went in, used the ticket, and then reached behind the guard and handed it to me, and I went in. And I had heard that this gallery owner, Tibor Denagi, was going to have an invitational exhibit. And I overheard someone say, Tibor. They were talking to this man. I thought, that must be Tibor Denagi. I went over and I introduced myself, and literally every guy there was in a tuxedo, and every woman was in an evening gown, and I was in a brown motorcycle jacket and a pair of jeans. So I obviously didn't look like I was supposed to be there, but anyway, I said, I think I've got some work that you'd be interested in, and I never thought he would come, but he did. came to my studio, walked in the studio with a friend, and the guy said, "I love that painting." I was like, "Wow, okay." And then Tibor said, "Beside that one, which other one do you want to show?" I was like, "I'm in the show." And I had been in New York a little over 6 months. So then I was in the situation where my friends were in graduate schools. There was now no point for me to go to graduate school because I was in New York. I was showing in New York. Why would I go to graduate school? You know, it's just, now I had to figure out what I was, you know, how I was going to live and all the rest. And walking down the street from that exhibit, I had seen a sign for a display artist wanted. So I applied for the job, and I got the job. Through attrition, I became the head of the display department. This is a person with no experience whatever in display. And a window on 57th Street that I had to decorate every couple of weeks. So anyway, that's how the accelerated New York, you know, impacted me and really ultimately did me in. I had to leave. But I thought, if I can do it once, I can probably do it again. So I wasn't feeling too bad about leaving.
Were you expecting that when you were so young? Like, did you dream of getting
this
attention?
You know, this is the thing. I had read a quote by Picasso, and it was basically, there's no point in leaving yourself locked up in your studio because you'll never meet anybody in your studio. So you've got to get out, and you've got to meet people, you know, and that's where opportunities would be coming. But the idea that I might be showing, you know, on 57th Street at the time, which was really a very big hub of the art world, I didn't think, you know, was going to happen, of course. And then once it happened, my friends blew my head to the size of a, because they thought that I had really made it, you know, and I couldn't quite fathom it all. But you know, I was 21, so.
I think that's a relatable challenge for a lot of artists. You know, you want people to fall in love with the artwork, and then you realize, oh wait, I'm part of that equation.
Yeah. And do I want to stay on this path? You know, do I want to stay in New York? And at the time, I didn't realize that actually the gallery owner was seriously interested in my work. I took it as a kind of like, you know, yeah, sure, we can include you too. But he was seriously interested in my work, and that was, I wasn't prepared for that. I didn't know how to handle success in a sense. You know, what is the follow-up to that? What should I have done next? Living in a sublet, didn't have any. I got fired from the display job. Anyway, I should spend too much time on my failures.
Well, they contribute to the successes too, right?
Later on. So this painting, tiger lilies against a pond. My son had a home where the pond was surrounded with tiger lilies. They were really beautiful. And it was squirreled away in my studio, and I wound up taking it out and photographing it again. And so now it's going to go to Art Basel in Switzerland, this one. There'll be another one coming up that's also going. But that's another thing is, you know, you never, I have found that as an artist, you can never say for sure which ones will appeal to people. You know, you might do one and you love it, and there's not much of a reaction to it, and you do another, and you don't have really high expectations for it, and all of a sudden that's the one that somebody just falls in love with again. So you just have to put them all out there and trust what you're doing. I guess that's the simple message. Acrylic on canvas. It's not too big. It's about 36 by 48 inches. This one is, as it says, skunk cabbage. So I had invented this technique where I would create paintings by putting a cloth, like sort of the weight of nylon and pushing paint through the cloth and letting the paint dry, and as it puckered, it created random patterns over the whole surface. And so those patterns are brought about by the cloth and the viscosity of the paint. But there was a very complete rendering of skunk cabbage first, and then I just began to kind of cover it up, first with black and then with white. And then I found out that when skunk cabbage first comes out of the ground, if there's still snow, they're very early, the heat of the skunk cabbage melts the snow around it. So this kind of completes that thought of what it can do. And it's interesting to me, the forms and the colors that they actually have.
You like playing with mediums and different processes, and was that a process that you had thought about before or were experimenting with?
I had done a whole series of paintings. After I left New York, I went back to Buffalo and taught high school at a place called Lafayette High School. That was an incredible experience because it was the first time that Buffalo tried to integrate its schools. And so they bused black kids from the east side of Buffalo to the west side of Buffalo and really put them in a very racist situation. But aside from that, during that time when I was living in Buffalo, I came up with this idea of what I call the shrunken cloth method. And from there I went to San Francisco, and I was doing very large paintings. They were like 11 feet by 6 feet or 7 feet, and I would lay them on the floor. I had one room that they could fit in, and then I would put succeeding layers of cloth and color, pushing it through, letting it dry. And I would decide on what color to use based on driving around until I found the color that seemed to be the most vibrant on a given day in the California sun. And then I would use that color as the, sort of the basis for the painting, the monochromatic series that I did. And so that started in 1970. And this painting is much later, 2017.
Well, I read that while you were teaching at Lafayette, you won an award. So you clearly resonated with the students while you were teaching there.
I did. Yeah, they named me their favorite teacher, which was the kiss of death for me because I couldn't go in the teacher's room because I was ostracized, by the teachers who just didn't get it. They were not happy with integrating, basically. And I had one Seneca student, and I had him in detention, right? He was also in my art class, but one time he was in my detention class, and he jumped out of a second-story room, just stood up on the windowsill, and next thing I knew, he jumped out, and I was like, oh my God, and landed on his feet. Yes. I'm like, Jake, get up here.
I'm glad you were there.
Yeah, I don't know if I did any good, but I was there. Oh my God, it was just So high school kids, they were something. They were interesting. Really.
Well, so when you were in California and during this time, were there certain colors that you were drawn to? Like you liked the vibrancy under the sun, and were there colors that were challenging to work with, or?
Well, for a little while, they were kind of like pastels, but they were a little stronger than that, But they were kind of probably had a lot of white in them. So it could be on a building, it could be floral, it could be whatever caught my eye as I was driving around. So one thing I did do is I went back to working in a display situation. The store I worked for in New York called Design Research had a branch at Ghirardelli Square in San Francisco. So when I went to San Francisco, I went to work again for Design Research. And so we're right on the bay. Golden Gate Bridge is here, Alcatraz is here, and that's when Alcatraz was occupied by Native people who took it over. And so that was all like right there, right off the shore.
Did you partake in?
I didn't, because at the time they were really struggling. You know, there was no electricity, and they really had a problem there was no water. They had to bring everything in. There might have been water, but everything else had to be brought in. And so it was kind of a struggle. At that point, I was just kind of coming into a sort of a consciousness of who I was in terms of being Seneca, really, more so than before. And my cousin was there, and we used to talk about all these things that we had experienced when we were growing up. And it kind of helped me to, I guess, start thinking really about, being Onondaga.
So when did you begin exploring that more in your work, like through subject matter?
Well, what happened next was in 1971, I moved back east again. And friends of mine were working at what's called the Museum of the American Indian, or the High Foundation. This is before the National Museum of the American Indian. And my friends decided to do a show of contemporary Native artists. And so they got hold of Fritz Scholder, George Morrison, Lloyd Oxendine, Neil Parsons, and myself. And so we were, the first to show contemporary work at that museum in decades. They had done something like that back in the 30s. And a very different style of work, of course. At any rate, that really began, and this man named Lloyd Oxendine, who was Lumbee, he decided he was going to open up an art gallery in Soho. And he asked me to be a part of it. And so then it was a beginning of a collective of contemporary artists who were all Native. And he was a visionary, really. He was ahead of his time. He got to be able to write an article for the magazine Art in America, and it wasn't edited. The way he wrote it is the way it came out. And he and I were then searching for artists who were going to be in that magazine, because at that point we were just beginning to find out who was doing what and where they lived, and we had the Institute of American Indian Arts as one starting point at least. But I would say probably 71, 72 was when I really began to think about it more so.
And there was a growing community then in New York City, right? And more kind of...
Yeah, this was like the Native American Theater Ensemble got a very glowing review in the New York Times, and here we were in Art in America, and it seemed like things are going to really take off now. It didn't. But it seemed that way at the time. And so
Maybe it planted a seed for things to keep.
Yeah, we didn't quit, but it was just a very early beginning of that idea,
Well, I read that you and Lloyd Oxendine began this kind of campaign to establish and promote contemporary Native art as art on the same level as all other art.
Yeah.
And also to, really make the point that Native art is also distinct in its content and subject matter. Yep. And, it can challenge our assumptions about what Native art should look like, and that's, as valid and legitimate as anything else. And I was wondering if you see that that's still something that, Haudenosaunee artists are working with to continue to do that, or if you think things have gotten better. Is that still a struggle for Indigenous artists?
It's the craziest thing, really. I mean, there have been, like we always say, there's sort of these waves where at the top, all of a sudden, there's a lot of activity, interest, etc., and things feel good. And usually it didn't last. On the other side, you went down, and it kind of went back to where, realistically, the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and pretty much the Whitney Museum, those doors were closed to us. We really didn't make inroads until about, for me, about 5 years ago. And I was very lucky because I was showing at a place called Artist Space, and a lot of people from the Whitney came to a talk that I was giving. And Jean Quick-to-See Smith was like the interviewer, right? And Jean is a very big supporter of me, so almost embarrassingly so. But at any rate, so she's there, and I was in a kind of a mood of like, it's time to kick the door down, and that's what I told them. I said, I hear a lot of talk. I mean, I hear you saying good things and all of that, but it is time to kick the door down, and I'm going to do it if I have to. Meaning, you have to start not just talk, but collect our work, show our work, if you really want to see change. And, you know, a lot of people have asked, like, well, how come it all of a sudden happened? And some people point to the George Floyd incident, you know, and this idea of inclusion. And I hate that word, just the idea, though. I mean, we're here, we've always been here, and, you know, so suddenly people just realize this and they're doing something about it, perhaps. What was the question?
Oh. Well, I was just thinking about, you know, this effort to promote Native art as art,
okay.
you know, which I think is, you know, I see it as a continuum that you and people before you have constantly made these interventions, like reminding the art world.
You're right. Okay, and so, like for example, Jean Quick-to-See was given a one-person show at the Whitney. That had not happened for any Native artist at all. Jean, because of her stature, put together a show at the National Gallery. The National Gallery has never shown Native artists. That show was there last fall. And so, you know, that's the same group, the same network. We've all kept on doing our thing in our wherever part of the region of the world or country we were in. And now it's sort of like we see the momentum continuing. But I guess it has taken a lot of knocking on doors and a lot of networking over the years to bring about a difference, which we wanted to see happen, you know. And for a long time, people would say to me, why don't you create an Indian market east, meaning like the Indian market in Santa Fe, why don't you have me put one together for the...
Just like that.
Yeah, yes. I said, well, I need a building. So I got to build a building first if we're going to be able to do this in times of the year when the weather's not permissible for an outdoor show. And I wanted to bring work indoors. And the night before our festival, have a show open, and then the artists can have their work at the festival, which is on the order of Swaya's idea for Indian market. And that idea is kind of spread now. Anosa Gwande is now doing something, just did it, you know, where they did a juried art show.
Yes.
Helped jury that show.
Oh, I was wondering. Yeah. Now I know for sure.
Right. So it takes time and it takes persistence to make something happen. But it is finally happening.
What's the challenge, do you think, now, today, for Indigenous artists, or is there one? Is it to keep that momentum going?
Well, the hardest thing in the world is to make a good painting. It is. So make good art, that's the challenge. Make relevant art, make good art, you know. This one here is one of my more recent pieces. This is the bark longhouse at Ganondagan, and the garden that we have there. All those sticks usually make a kind of a wooden fencing that goes around the garden. I'm just using them as sort of props. This piece was collected by the Birchfield Penny Art Center in Buffalo, and it's the actual painting is 8 feet by 4 feet.
Wow.
So it's a large one. And I've been working in large format for the last 3 or 4, well, at least 3 years. Yeah, this is oil on canvas. And so then I went to this one, and this is also 8 feet by 4 feet. And a museum in Paris, Kay Branley, bought this. And we worked with Kay Branley on a wampum exhibit, where we brought wampum that has been in France since the middle of the 1600s back, and we mounted that exhibit at Ganondagan, and then it traveled to the McCord Museum in Montreal. But we had gone over to look at their collection, and in the process, they looked at my art, so they bought this.
Tell us a little bit about the title for this one.
Yeah, it's kind of, a Gene Autry song. Or Roy Rogers, one of those two. I think it's actually Gene Autry. But the real title is "We Used to Be Free Like the Birds and the Animals," and that's really what it's about. It's that we have to give ourselves our own freedom. We can't let ourselves be kind of limited and restricted by what other people want us to be or do, whatever. And so trying to find the way to free ourselves, something like that.
That seems like a theme that's been building throughout your career.
Yeah.
In your work.
It could be. Yeah. And I think there's one of, this is kind of taking a segment of that sort of image. I really like milkweed, and I've used it a lot. And this is when they're more open and the things are blowing around. The pods are blowing around. Again, oil on canvas.
So I think I read that it was not until after college that you began to actually see other Indigenous artists.
Yeah.
Which seems shocking now with, so many more Indigenous artists around.
Yeah.
But, tell us a little bit about that. There was no one in the
So I went to
classes,
Buffalo State, and then in Buffalo, New York, and then I went on, did a little bit of graduate work at SUNY Albany, just printmaking. And then I went back for graduate work at University of Buffalo. But in all of my art career, in college at least, I never saw one image of a Native American artist or artwork by a Native artist. Nothing in any art history. And I've been talking about, I just came back from the Venice Biennale and a trip back to Siena, a city where I lived when I was 19. And while I was living there, we would study, I went to the University of Siena, and we would study a native artist, and we'd study a city. We'd spend a week studying a particular city, and then on Friday night we would get on a bus and travel to that city and see the art, the architects, the architectural, collections, and we would be learning about the patrons for that art, and we would go back home again to Siena, and then the next week we'd study another city, so and another group of artists, and so I was really immersed in Rinascimento or Renaissance art, and to go back now and to look at it again was an interesting experience because I see it with a whole different set of eyes than when I was 19 and knew very little about all that it meant, all that it really involved. To visit a cathedral today and to realize what resources were expended to build the cathedrals that you can imagine, the Duomo, the Sistine Chapel or any others that you can think of. And off the backs and off Indigenous people and, of peasants, the backs of peasants, to glorify God and Jesus, I mean, is that wrong? I'm not judging that part of it, but to realize, I was so immersed in it and just really focused on the artist. And this is the way the class would run. We'd be sitting in our seats, in a tight row, and the professor would come in the room. You'd stand up, you'd stand at attention until he got to the front of the room, turn around and faced you. Then you all sat down, and you didn't say a word unless he called upon you. And it was this very strict kind of old school, way of teaching classical art. And it just really, that was my background. In the afternoon, okay, so this is the morning. Language, history, art. And then in the afternoon, we would go to the high school in Siena, and they taught us how to do fresco painting and also how to do sculpture, like building with plaster. And they had a technique where they could remove the fresco from the wall. And they wouldn't show us how they did it, but they could remove the fresco from the wall. And it was almost like they were using, I can't even think of what that cloth is, cheesecloth. Very, very flimsy. But they would just mat it over the surface and take it off and then stretch it over stretcher bars. Amazing.
And yet you never wanted to experiment more with frescoes or sculpture?
Not really. I don't know why I didn't have that desire. I fell in love with oil painting, and I wanted to learn to paint with oil as much as I could. And Leonardo, something like that.
Well, were there other European or other non-native artists that inspired you earlier on?
Well, when I was about a junior in high school, there was a Van Gogh exhibit at the Albright Knox Art Gallery, and my mother took us to see it. And I was really impressed with Van Gogh's drawings. I know that. And then the next one I went to see when I was a senior in high school, I think, was Andrew Wyeth. And both of those, of course, remained artists that I looked at and I liked. But while I was in undergraduate work, I met Charles Birchfield. I actually got to know him, in a sense. We actually corresponded. From Italy, I wrote to him. And I have the letter, which is crazy, that came from him. Anyway.
Did he offer advice?
Yeah, I kind of did. But my work was so poor at the time. I mean, it wasn't really, I didn't have anything substantial for him to look at or critique. I was just more interested in him. He told a story. He had sold a painting to the Boston Museum of Art, Boston Museum of Fine Art, I think it's called. Anyway, he went there one day to look at it, and with his wife, and he saw the painting and he said, "Oh God, I've got to fix that. That can't be. I got to take that back and fix it." No, you can't do that. He goes, I've got to have that painting back so I can fix it. And the museum director said no, and he wouldn't budge. Nope, you're not taking it. And so Charles Birchfield is up on stage talking, and he's about my age, maybe a little bit older, and he says, just because he was the director of a big museum doesn't mean he knew anything about art. So, like a 19-year-old kid that was really...
It stood out.
It stood out. Yeah. I liked that. For a guy that didn't look, anything like that, he seemed so mild-mannered. And I liked his very early work. I liked his black and white stuff.
So he never got to fix the painting? That was it?
He never got to fix the painting. They wouldn't let him have it.
Wow.
Yeah. And this is what they did. So he had a painting with him. Like say, this painting's up here. And then what he would do is, if he saw something he didn't like, he would repaint it on another piece of paper, and he'd glue that piece on to the painting and over the top of the area that he didn't think worked. And he was so good at it, you wouldn't see the seams unless you really looked very carefully where these pieces joined.
Wow.
Yeah, and he did a lot of that. But it's not visible when you stand and look at the paintings until you realize that that was part of his technique, was to correct errors by adding another piece of paper over the top. Very skillfully.
Have you ever had to repair any of your paintings?
I did. Well, I painted a dead chicken. And I was inspired by a man named Chaim Soutine, who is in the collection of the Albright Knox. And he painted dead chickens too. I went to the Broadway market, picked out a chicken, they wrung its neck, and I took it home. And I hung it up on the porch of my apartment, and I painted this dead chicken. And it really alarmed my neighbors when they get that dead chicken off the porch. Anyway, so when I got out of school, I put it in my parents' attic, and it remained there for 60 plus years. The dust on it was about that thick. But my friend told that story repeatedly, the one who included me in the show at the Museum of the American Indian. And his wife decided to write a book about him. My friend is now deceased. And so she did, and she said, he always talked about the dead chicken painting. Do you have it? I do, but I've got to get it cleaned up, right? And I began to take off the layers of dust and take it off, and take it off, take it off. And I finally got down to the actual surface of the painting, you know. And then I just used sunflower oil. And I went back over the surface and cleaned it up, and it sort of came back to life again, you know, and it looked pretty good. For something I painted when I think I was maybe 18, actually, around that time period.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And, you know, it's funny because, again, like, I show the painting, and people fall in love with it. Who would think? You know, it's big. It's probably about this tall.
Do you have it now? Or?
Yeah.
Oh.
It's in my gallery in Buffalo.
At K-Art?
K-Art has it.
So Pete is represented by K-Art Gallery in Buffalo.
And by 47 Canal in New York.
Excellent.
Yeah. One more, maybe. I think there's a couple. So this is one of the most recent paintings. Again, it's 4 feet by 8 feet. And landback horse, ohio. That's what we call Allegheny in Onondaga Goano is ohio. So what happened in 1965, the Army Corps of Engineers condemned 10,000 acres of Seneca land when they built the Kinzua Dam. And the reason they condemned it was because they thought there was going to be at some time water high enough that it would flood areas adjacent to the river. And that's never happened to date. And so the land has been there all this time. And so now our people are looking at this and saying, it's time that we reuse that land and took it back into our possession and made it useful. And so we have a group of people, I would call it the Land Back Committee, that's working on various efforts to return land to us. There are people who want to give us land. There's ways in which we can receive land, but we have to kind of activate that and make it happen. And so this kind of comes along with that thought.
Why did you decide to have the horse?
Well, this horse is part of a painting that I painted in 1978. In 1978, I painted 2 paintings. I was a terrible drunk, literally, and the only thing I could do, we were running Sonova, the Seneca Nation Organization for the Visual Arts, and all I had to do was keep supervising the traditional artists that were working and try to stay sober. But I painted this horse, and my son said, you should use that horse again. You should put him into a different painting. And so this is very different than the way he looks in the original, but essentially the same position, same pose. And what happened was when I showed that painting, which is very small, it's like this with a horse right in the middle and a Ohio landscape in the background again. I was living in Allegheny. Everyone got the mood because I was in this very depressed state. And whenever I would show the painting, people right away got the mood from the painting. So it could communicate, you know, not necessarily a good time in my life, but it could communicate. It was painted right before I decided I had to change my geographic location and move to New York City and work for the American Indian Community House and run the gallery. And that began that whole new phase of, you know, things going on.
So the horse has real personal history for you,
It has
too.
a real personal history, yes, it does. And he's back.